The fastest way to discover who truly owns a road is to watch what happens when someone tries to stop the owner from driving on it. I still remember the sound that morning better than anything I could see. My truck tires crunched across the familiar gravel just before sunrise, the same steady rhythm I had heard since I was old enough to sit beside my grandfather on the worn leather bench seat of his old pickup. The air smelled like fresh cedar, damp earth, and coastal Bermuda grass after an overnight shower, while a thin layer of fog drifted across the entrance to our 400-acre ranch. Everything looked exactly the way it had for decades until I rounded the final bend and saw a black steel barrier stretched across the road. A polished stone guardhouse stood where an old wooden cattle gate used to be, its spotless windows reflecting the first orange glow of the Texas sunrise. Two uniformed security guards stepped into the road before I even had time to put my truck in park. One raised his hand with practiced confidence while the other held a clipboard against his chest like it carried more authority than a county courthouse. "This entrance is restricted to authorized community residents," the taller guard said without the slightest hesitation. "You will need to turn around." For a second, I honestly believed they had mistaken me for a delivery driver. I rolled down my window and smiled politely. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," I replied. "My name is Logan Brooks. My family owns everything beyond this gate." Neither man moved. They exchanged a quick glance before the shorter guard shook his head. "Sir, our instructions are very clear. Without an approved community access credential, nobody enters through this road." I looked past them toward the distant red barn that my grandfather had built with his own hands more than 50 years earlier. The old windmill still turned slowly above the water well. The southern pasture shimmered beneath the rising sun, while dozens of cattle grazed peacefully across the rolling hills. Every fence post, every oak tree, every stretch of gravel carried a memory from my childhood. Yet somehow I was sitting less than 50 feet away from all of it, while complete strangers calmly informed me that I was no longer welcome. I reached into the center console and picked up the old brass key that had remained on my key ring ever since my father handed it to me the day he retired. It no longer opened the modern security gate standing in front of me, but I carried it anyway, because some things deserve to be remembered even after they stop being useful. The taller guard noticed the key and gave me a sympathetic smile. "That old gate is gone," he said. "Things have changed around here." Maybe he believed those words. Maybe everyone inside that subdivision believed them. But I kept staring at the gravel road disappearing between the oak trees because I knew something they did not. Roads do not change ownership simply because someone builds a prettier entrance. Signs do not rewrite deeds. Security guards do not replace county records. What neither of those men realized was that by refusing to let me drive down the road my grandfather had built, they had already made the single mistake that would eventually cost their entire homeowners association the access they had taken for granted for years. I sat there for another moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to my engine idle while the guards returned to their spotless little booth as though they had just completed another ordinary task. The smell of damp gravel drifted through the open window, mixing with fresh hay carried by the cool morning breeze from somewhere deep inside the ranch. I could still see the weathered red roof of our barn through the oak trees, and for the first time in my life, it looked farther away than 400 acres had any right to feel. That land had never simply been property to my family. It was where every generation had left behind something that could never be measured in dollars. My grandfather, Harold Brooks, bought the original parcel in 1967 after spending years saving every extra paycheck he earned repairing farm equipment across central Texas. He started with 120 acres, a small weathered farmhouse, and enough determination to outwork every obstacle that stood between him and the life he wanted for his family. Over the next 30 years, he purchased neighboring fields whenever another rancher retired, slowly connecting one parcel after another until the ranch stretched across 400 acres of pasture, hay fields, oak groves, ponds, and gently rolling hills. My father often said the land grew because Grandpa never chased shortcuts. He chased opportunities. By the time I was old enough to help repair fences, every corner of the ranch carried a story. I knew exactly where the gravel became loose after heavy rain, which creek overflowed every spring, and where wild deer crossed the north pasture just before sunrise. Saturday mornings always began with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the farmhouse kitchen while Dad checked the weather forecast on an old radio that crackled louder than it played music. Then we climbed into his faded pickup and drove down the same gravel entrance those guards now claimed required permission to use. Even the sound beneath the tires became part of my childhood. That steady crunch meant another day fixing fences, feeding cattle, cutting hay, or simply riding beside my father while he taught me that taking care of land meant thinking decades ahead instead of just until next season. When my parents retired, they never considered selling the ranch. Neither did I. Some people inherit investments. I inherited responsibility. We leased grazing rights to neighboring ranchers, harvested coastal Bermuda hay every year, maintained every fence line ourselves, and preserved the property exactly the way my grandfather had always insisted it should be preserved. Everything changed about 6 years earlier when construction crews arrived beyond our southern fence line. At first, the changes seemed harmless. Bulldozers replaced open pasture. Survey trucks appeared almost every week. Streets were paved where cattle once grazed, followed by rows of beautiful new homes with stone entrances, carefully trimmed lawns, and decorative streetlights. Most of the families who moved there were friendly. Children waved whenever they spotted the horses. Neighbors occasionally stopped to ask about ranch life or compliment the old windmill standing near the pond. I genuinely believed we would become good neighbors. Looking back now, I realize I spent so much time watching houses rise from empty fields that I never noticed something far more important quietly disappearing one small decision at a time. While everyone admired the new neighborhood taking shape, somebody else had already started rewriting the story of the only road connecting my family's past to its future. The first person from the new neighborhood I ever met was Rebecca Collins. And if you had asked me that day whether she would become the center of the biggest property dispute my family had ever faced, I would have laughed. She arrived at the ranch in a spotless white sport utility vehicle wearing a crisp white blazer that somehow stayed perfectly clean despite the dusty Texas roads. She introduced herself as the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association and thanked me for welcoming the growing community. Her smile was polished, her handshake was firm, and every word sounded thoughtful. She spoke about cooperation, respecting neighboring landowners, and building lasting relationships. I believed every sentence because I had no reason not to. During those first months, the neighborhood blended naturally into the landscape. Construction crews waved whenever they passed our fence. Families slowed their cars so children could watch the cattle grazing across the south pasture. On weekends, I occasionally answered questions about ranch life, while neighbors admired the old windmill or took photographs of the sunset reflecting across our largest pond. Everything felt exactly the way good neighbors should behave. Then small changes began appearing around the entrance road, each one so minor that nobody would have questioned it alone. First, decorative directional signs pointed visitors toward the subdivision using the same gravel entrance my grandfather had built decades earlier. A few weeks later, neatly trimmed flower beds appeared closer to the roadside than before, making the entrance seem visually connected to the neighborhood instead of the ranch. Then attractive stone markers displaying the community name were installed beside the road, just outside my fence line. I noticed each addition, but they seemed harmless. After all, landscaping did not change ownership. A few months later, someone handed me a glossy neighborhood brochure during a local charity event. The subdivision map showed my gravel road in exactly the same color as every private street inside the development. There was no indication that it belonged to a family ranch built long before the first house was ever constructed. I contacted the management office and politely explained the mistake. Rebecca personally called me back, apologized for what she described as a printing oversight, and assured me future editions would be corrected. I appreciated the professionalism and moved on. Unfortunately, the corrections never arrived. Instead, the changes became more noticeable. Delivery drivers began assuming they were entering neighborhood property. Visitors occasionally stopped at temporary information signs before continuing toward my ranch. Survey flags appeared near the shoulder of the road, disappeared, then quietly returned in different locations. New residents started referring to the entrance as the community road because that was the only description they had ever heard. None of it happened overnight. It unfolded one careful step after another until perception slowly began replacing history. Then came the security booth. Rebecca announced it as a simple improvement for neighborhood safety, explaining that guards would help visitors find the correct addresses while protecting residents from unwanted traffic. At first, the guards simply waved as I drove through. Then they started asking unfamiliar drivers where they were going. Soon, contractors delivering supplies to the ranch were asked additional questions before continuing. Every new procedure sounded reasonable by itself, yet together they formed something much larger than routine security. Looking back now, I realize Rebecca was never trying to seize 400 acres of ranch land. She was quietly teaching everyone around her to believe that the road leading there had always belonged to someone else. The morning after those guards turned me away, I came back before sunrise hoping common sense would solve what paperwork had somehow failed to prevent. The air was cool enough to carry the scent of wet cedar and freshly cut grass across the entrance, while a mockingbird sang somewhere near the old fence line. I parked beside the road, stepped out with nothing but a folder containing copies of my deed, property tax records, and survey maps, then walked toward the security booth. The same two guards recognized me immediately. Their expressions remained polite, but neither reached for the control panel that lifted the barrier. One of them asked if I had obtained a community access credential since yesterday. I smiled and explained once again that I did not need permission to enter property my family had owned for generations. He listened carefully, glanced toward the laminated instruction sheet hanging inside the booth, then quietly apologized before repeating that he could only follow the written policies provided by the Homeowners Association. I asked who had signed those policies. Without hesitation, he answered, "Rebecca Collins." I thanked both men because I knew they were simply doing the jobs they had been hired to do. My real conversation needed to happen somewhere else. Less than 20 minutes later, I walked into the neighborhood clubhouse where polished hardwood floors reflected the morning sunlight pouring through oversized windows. The building smelled faintly of fresh coffee, new paint, and expensive furniture polish. Rebecca greeted me with the same professional smile she had worn the first day we met, invited me into the conference room, and offered me a cup of coffee as though nothing unusual had happened. I placed my documents on the table and calmly explained that her security staff had denied me access to my own ranch. She listened without interrupting, folded her hands neatly together, and then slid a colorful community map across the polished table. Her finger followed the gravel entrance before stopping on a label that identified it as a shared community access corridor. She explained that emergency vehicles, utility companies, contractors, landscaping crews, and residents had relied on that entrance for years, making organized access essential for the neighborhood. I reminded her that convenience and ownership were not the same thing. She leaned back slightly and answered with complete confidence that public perception often became just as important as historical paperwork. Those words stayed with me long after I left the clubhouse. During the following weeks, that perception spread even further. Feed deliveries for my cattle were delayed while drivers answered questions at the checkpoint. A veterinarian visiting one of my mares waited nearly half an hour before being allowed through. Friends called from the entrance asking whether they needed special authorization just to stop by for dinner. Even a fencing contractor joked that he never imagined a ranch owner would need permission from a subdivision to reach his own property. Each delay seemed small by itself, but together they created the impression that someone else had the authority to decide who could travel a road my grandfather had built decades before the first house appeared on that horizon. I never raised my voice. Instead, I documented every conversation, photographed every new sign, saved every email, and wrote down every date, because something deep inside me kept whispering that the truth was not disappearing. It was simply waiting for the right piece of evidence to bring it back into the light. For the first time since all of this began, I wondered whether patience alone would be enough. I scheduled a meeting with a respected real estate attorney in the county seat, carrying a folder so thick with deeds, surveys, tax records, photographs, and notes that it barely fit beneath my arm. His office overlooked the courthouse square where pickup trucks lined the streets and old brick buildings had watched generations of land disputes come and go. He spent nearly an hour reading every document without interrupting. Finally, he removed his glasses, folded his hands together, and gave me an answer I had not expected. He told me there was no question that my family owned the ranch. The deeds were clear, the tax history was complete, and the recorded boundaries matched the county records. The problem, he explained, was that the homeowners association had slowly created years of routine control over the entrance. Untangling that situation could require additional surveys, county reviews, and careful legal preparation rather than a quick courtroom victory. I thanked him, but I left feeling as though the road home had somehow become even longer. During the following days, the checkpoint tightened its grip, one inconvenience at a time. A truck delivering cattle feed waited nearly an hour before reaching the barn because the driver was told to remain outside until someone verified his destination. A family friend bringing replacement fence posts called me from the entrance after being asked whether he had written authorization to enter. An insurance adjuster visiting to inspect one of our equipment sheds was politely told to return another day because his name did not appear on an approval list. None of those delays ruined my business, but together they quietly chipped away at something much larger than efficiency. They encouraged everyone passing through that entrance to believe someone else controlled the road. Rebecca seemed more confident every time we crossed paths. At one county planning meeting, she spoke calmly about preserving neighborhood organization, protecting residents, and maintaining responsible traffic management. She never claimed to own my ranch because she knew she could not. Instead, she repeatedly described the entrance as the community's established access corridor. I watched people around the room nod as though they had heard those words for years. It struck me that perception could become remarkably powerful when repeated often enough. That evening I drove around the checkpoint by using an older ranch trail that reached the north pasture after several rough miles. The sun had already dropped behind the hills, leaving long shadows across the weathered equipment barn where my grandfather had spent countless evenings repairing tractors beneath a single hanging light bulb. I stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of aged cedar, machine oil, dry leather, and decades of honest work. Dust floated through narrow beams of fading sunlight, while rows of carefully labeled cabinets stood exactly where Grandpa had left them. He believed every important document deserved a permanent home because memories could fade while recorded facts endured. I ran my fingers across the worn wooden drawers until they stopped on a small brass lock that looked strangely familiar. The old brass key I had carried every day since my father retired rested quietly inside my pocket. Suddenly, I realized it had never been important because it opened a gate. Its true purpose had been waiting inside this barn all along, protecting something my grandfather believed one day his family might desperately need. The old brass key slid into the tiny lock as though it had been waiting for that exact moment all these years. The cabinet door opened with a soft click followed by the faint scent of aged paper, cedar, and machine oil that instantly carried me back to evenings spent watching my grandfather organize every important document before locking them away. Dust floated through narrow beams of golden light pouring between the wooden barn boards while I carefully lifted several thick folders tied together with faded cotton string. Grandpa had labeled everything in neat block letters. Property deeds, tax records, fence agreements, water rights, county surveys. He never trusted memory when permanent records could protect the future. I carried the folders to his old workbench, brushed away a thin layer of dust, and slowly opened the largest file. Inside rested an original engineering survey recorded with the county decades before the subdivision even existed. The heavy paper crackled softly as I unfolded it across the table. Every fence line matched the ranch exactly as it stood today. Every pasture, creek, pond, and property marker appeared precisely where I had known them since childhood. Then my eyes settled on the entrance road. It had been outlined with bold survey markings and accompanied by several recorded legal references that I had never noticed before. Behind the survey rested another document bearing official county, recording numbers, and my grandfather's signature. Beside the signature of the neighboring landowner from more than 50 years earlier, it was the original right-of-way agreement governing the gravel entrance. I read every sentence carefully, refusing to rush through a single word. The agreement granted limited access across the private road to neighboring properties, but ownership and exclusive control of the roadway itself always remained with the Brooks family. More importantly, one provision explained that continued access depended upon the owner never being denied unrestricted use of the road. Any material interference with that right constituted a breach of the agreement, allowing the owner to terminate the access privilege through the legal process described within the document. I stopped reading and quietly leaned against the workbench while everything finally came together. Rebecca had spent years convincing everyone that routine management somehow created authority. Instead, her own policies had produced documented evidence showing repeated interference with the owner's legal access. The answer had never been hidden inside complicated arguments. It had been preserved inside a filing cabinet by a man who believed future generations should never rely on assumptions when facts could be recorded. Early the next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office carrying the original documents inside protective sleeves. The clerk compared every recording number against the official archive before printing certified copies of each record. She confirmed that the agreement remained valid exactly as filed, and that no amendment had ever transferred ownership or control of the roadway away from my family. I thanked her, gathered the certified copies, and stepped outside into the warm Texas sunshine, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. The courthouse clock echoed across the square while a light breeze carried the smell of fresh coffee from the cafe on the corner. For the first time since those guards lowered the barrier in front of my truck, I no longer felt like someone trying to prove he belonged. I felt like the lawful owner preparing to enforce rights that had been carefully protected long before anyone imagined. Building a neighborhood beside my family's ranch. I never contacted Rebecca to celebrate what I had found, because real leverage never comes from surprising people with words. It comes from surprising them with preparation. The next several days became the quietest and most productive week I had experienced since this entire dispute began. I hired a licensed land surveyor whose family had worked across Central Texas for decades. Early one cool morning, he arrived with modern surveying equipment, bright orange boundary markers, and copies of the original engineering maps I had obtained from the county. Together we walked every foot of the entrance road while the smell of warm cedar drifted through the air and meadowlarks called from the fence posts surrounding the pasture. Every measurement confirmed exactly what my grandfather's records had shown. The road remained private property belonging to the Brooks family. The surveyor smiled as he compared the new measurements with the original drawings and quietly said that whoever completed the first survey had done remarkable work. Hearing those words somehow felt like another conversation with Grandpa. My attorney then reviewed every certified document, every photograph, every written note I had collected during the previous weeks, and every recorded incident where access to my ranch had been delayed or denied. Instead of preparing an emotional argument, she prepared a careful legal notice explaining that repeated interference with the owner's unrestricted access represented a material breach of the recorded agreement. Because that condition had been violated, my family intended to exercise the legal remedy described within the original document. Copies were delivered to the Homeowners Association, the County Transportation Department, the county clerk, emergency service administrators, utility companies, and the sheriff's office so that everyone would understand exactly what was happening before anything changed. Nobody received different information. Everyone received the same facts supported by the same certified records. While those notices were being delivered, I contacted a local steel fabricator whose father had helped repair ranch equipment alongside my own father many years earlier. He built a heavy ranch gate designed to fit precisely within the surveyed property line. Watching the installation crew unload the steel posts onto the gravel felt strangely emotional because I realized I was not building a barrier against neighbors. I was restoring a boundary that should never have been ignored. The crew worked carefully beneath a bright Texas sky while concrete cured around the gate posts, and every hinge was aligned with exact measurements taken from the certified survey. New signs were installed beside the entrance, but unlike the decorative signs that had appeared over the years, these contained only simple factual language identifying the roadway as private property and directing visitors to obtain written authorization from the owner before entering. My attorney approved every sentence before the signs were mounted. Later that afternoon, a county transportation inspector stopped by to compare the installation with the survey markers already verified in the official records. After a careful inspection, he confirmed that everything complied with county requirements and did not interfere with any public roadway. By sunset, the work was finished. The new gate stood quietly beside the familiar gravel entrance while cattle grazed peacefully beyond the fence, and the old windmill turned slowly against the orange sky. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet everything had changed. Rebecca still believed the homeowners association controlled the entrance because her security guards continued following the same routine they had practiced for years. What she did not realize was that every document had already been certified, every measurement had already been verified, every legal notice had already been delivered, and the next ordinary morning would become the moment when assumptions finally collided with recorded truth. The following Monday began like any other morning in Central Texas, with pale sunlight spilling across the pastures and a cool breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut hay through the open fields. I unlocked my new ranch gate just after dawn, drove a short distance inside the property, and quietly waited beside the fence while the world woke up around me. Birds called from the oak trees, cattle wandered toward the watering pond, and for a few peaceful minutes the entrance looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood, except for one important difference. Everything standing there now matched the certified survey recorded at the county courthouse. A little after 7 o'clock, the first sport utility vehicle rolled toward the exit from inside the subdivision. The driver slowed, stared at the closed gate ahead, and stopped in complete confusion. Within minutes, another vehicle joined the line, followed by a landscaping trailer, a delivery van, a utility truck, and eventually a school bus carrying children to class. Nobody shouted. Nobody panicked. They simply looked toward the entrance, trying to understand why the road they had used every day suddenly ended at a gate they could not open. My phone rang exactly as I expected. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. I answered calmly. Her voice remained professional, but the confidence I had heard during every previous conversation had begun to fade. She asked why the entrance had been closed and reminded me that the neighborhood depended on that road. I explained that the certified notices delivered several days earlier had described everything in detail. Repeated interference with the owner's unrestricted access constituted a material breach of the recorded right-of-way agreement, and the legal remedy outlined in that agreement had now been exercised. There was a long silence before she quietly replied that there had to be another solution. I told her there always had been. It simply required respecting the rights that had existed long before the subdivision was built. Less than 30 minutes later, the county transportation inspector arrived according to the inspection schedule established earlier that week. My attorney stood beside the surveyor while certified copies of the original engineering maps, recorded deeds, and county records were carefully compared with the boundary markers already placed along the road. A deputy from the sheriff's office remained nearby only to ensure everything proceeded peacefully while the documentation was reviewed. Even the security guards who had stopped my truck days earlier stood quietly beside their booth watching the inspection unfold. They had never been my enemies. They had simply trusted policies that turned out to be smaller than the law itself. Rebecca soon arrived carrying binders filled with neighborhood rules, internal maps, maintenance plans, and years of community records. She respectfully presented everything she believed supported the subdivision's position. My attorney listened without interruption before placing the original recorded agreement on the table beside the county survey and asking one simple question. Can you provide any recorded document transferring ownership or legal control of this roadway? Rebecca searched through every binder she had brought, turning page after page while the only sounds came from rustling paper, distant cattle, and the wind moving through the oak trees. No such document existed because none had ever been recorded. By early afternoon, the county officials confirmed exactly what my grandfather's filing cabinet had preserved for more than half a century. The Homeowners Association acknowledged the legal findings, agreed to remove the checkpoint, and accepted that any future access would require a properly negotiated agreement instead of assumptions. Standing there beside that familiar gravel road, I realized the victory had never come from closing a gate. It came from proving that the truth had been waiting patiently in black ink all along. Several weeks later, the entrance looked almost exactly the way it had when I was a boy riding beside my grandfather through the early morning fog. The temporary security booth had been removed. The decorative signs suggesting someone else controlled the road had quietly disappeared. Fresh gravel covered the places where barriers once stood, and the only gate remaining was the steel ranch gate resting precisely where the certified survey said it belonged. Every morning, I unlocked it with the same old brass key that had opened my grandfather's filing cabinet, and every time I heard the latch click, I remembered that the smallest objects sometimes protect the greatest legacies. The Homeowners Association eventually agreed to negotiate a completely new recorded access agreement. This time, every condition was written clearly, reviewed by both attorneys, verified by the county, and recorded exactly as my grandfather would have wanted. The neighborhood received limited legal access for residents, utility companies, emergency services, school transportation, and scheduled deliveries, but ownership and exclusive control of the roadway remained with the Brooks family exactly as it always had. The agreement also made one point unmistakably clear. Any future interference with the owner's unrestricted access would again become a material breach subject to the remedies provided by law. There would be no confusion, no assumptions, and no opportunity for anyone to quietly rewrite history. Rebecca attended the final meeting with a noticeably different attitude than the woman who had once assured me that perception mattered more than paperwork. She spoke respectfully, acknowledged that the situation should have been handled differently, and signed the revised agreement without objection. A short time later, the Homeowners Association elected new leadership, and the incoming board requested a meeting at the ranch rather than the clubhouse. We sat beneath the shade of the old oak trees while they asked thoughtful questions about maintaining a good relationship with neighboring landowners. They even offered to contribute toward future maintenance of the gravel road since their residents benefited from using it every day. That simple conversation accomplished more than months of unnecessary conflict because it began with respect instead of assumptions. Life on the ranch quickly returned to the rhythm I had always known. The cattle still wandered across the south pasture each morning. The windmill continued turning above the well as it had for generations. Hay season arrived right on schedule, and the familiar sound of pickup trucks rolling across the gravel once again meant neighbors, friends, suppliers, and family instead of uncertainty. Sometimes I parked beside the entrance near sunset and watched children riding bicycles through the neighborhood, while delivery trucks and utility vehicles passed peacefully down the road. Nobody argued anymore because everyone understood exactly where the boundary stood. Looking back now, I realized this story was never really about winning a dispute. It was about protecting something entrusted to me long before I understood its value. My grandfather never taught me that paperwork was more important than people. He taught me that honest records protect honest relationships because everyone knows where they stand. The old brass key stayed on my key ring, not because I still needed it to open a cabinet, but because it reminded me that patience often accomplishes what anger never can. Roads can be resurfaced, gates can be replaced, neighborhoods can grow, and landscapes can change, but recorded truth does not disappear simply because someone speaks louder than history. In the end, I did not reclaim anything new. I simply restored what had quietly belonged to my family all along, proving once again that real justice does not arrive with noise or revenge. It arrives with preparation, integrity, and the quiet confidence that the truth has enough time to find its way home.